Hello, you're listening to Wine Blast, and in this episode, the podcast lives up to its name because we are busy getting our minds blown by the fine wines of Portugal.
Yeah, so everyone knows port, right? You know, it's a rare example of a wine that kind of headlines knowledge about a country rather than the other way round. But I'd hazard a guess that, you know, beyond port, and maybe Madeira, our knowledge and appreciation of the fine wines of Portugal can be pretty limited.
Now you mean fine table wines, don't you? So not fortified.
Exactly. Normal wines.
So still reds and whites from all over Portugal.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd agree. I mean, we've travelled round and tasted a fair bit from Portugal over the years, but still, I think this is something I'd happily admit not knowing a huge amount about. But you, on the other hand, recently got a chance to get to know the wines and producers a bit better, didn't you?
Yes, I did. And,
lucky
you know,
you.
I was blown away. So I thought we should share this and discuss it and explore this subject a little bit more because it's something to get excited about.
For me, Portugal is the paradise in the world for the ones that love wine and food. I think Portugal's still a diamond, unshaped, unpolished. It's almost possible to produce everything you want. You can really surprise yourself.
Tomas Roquette of Quinta do Crasto there. Now, we'll be hearing more from him in due course, as well as other top Portuguese wine talent, including Dirk and Daniel Niepoort, Sandra Tavares, Susana, Esteban, on why Portuguese wine deserves your time and attention. We've also got some beautiful wines lined up to taste, including the legend that is Barca Velha.
We do. They're all here. They're on the table in front of us, and I'm having to massively restrain myself. From just
hold yourself back.
Tucking in. I mean, I've got a little bit going, but yeah, we need to go zen. Be patient. All good things come to those who wait. Anyway, so before we get started, we did just want to feature a couple of your comments about our Santorini mini-series, didn't we? You know, we've had some great feedback about this, so thank you so much. If you haven't listened to it, do now. It's ace. Absolutely fascinating.
He says modestly.
Fun.
Yeah.
Whatever.
We are fascinating
Modesty's
and fun,
out
are we
the
not?
window here. No, it's the content that makes it and the people. But anyway, you know, for example, Aaron got in touch to say, thank you for the fascinating and hugely enjoyable listening. I'm a huge fan of the podcast. Inspired by your episodes on Santorini, we opened a bottle of 2018 Hatzidakis Skitali, which is £40 from the Wine Society. Not cheap, but excellent. Served with homemade gnocchi and pumpkin seed pesto, which was a seriously great match. And he very kindly sent us a photo of the food and wine. It looked absolutely delicious. Massive food and wine envy there, didn't we? Good work, Aaron.
Yeah, and Cameron from Sydney wrote in to say, really enjoyed this. Would love to visit Santorini this year when I'm in Greece, but I can't make it. So I'll have to drink as much Assyrtiko as I can. Also, how fascinating was it to hear from Javier Bardem on all things Santorini? i.e. Yanis. Surely it wasn't just me. I need to unpack this a bit because so what Cameron's referring to is, you know, he thinks Yanis Paraskevopoulos from Gaia sounds like the actor Javier Bardem, and I think he's probably right.
I love the thought. There could be something in that. You know,
absolutely.
he does have quite a theatrical sort of melodic voice, doesn't he?
Talking of voices, you're sounding a bit Barry White today, aren't you? What's going on there? I wonder.
Yeah, I am.
She says knowingly.
I'm not gonna go public on this. All I'm going to say is that last night involved some singing at tops of voices.
In a
I'm
dodgy
going to
club.
leave that one there. No, excuse me.
Dad dancing.
Excuse me. Just singing. Anyway, so yes, do drink lots of Santorini Assyrtiko to make up for it, Cameron. On a similar but also sort of alarming note, we heard from Jonathan in New York who said, I was so inspired by your recent series on Santorini that I marched over to my local wine shop. I love the idea of him marching over to try and find some much lauded Santorini Assyrtiko, but was devastated to find none. Alas, I had to comfort myself by purchasing 2 bottles of rosé from the Canary Islands and another from Abruzzo. He added that responding to your question on the best wine destinations, I'd have to say my favourite wine destinations thus far are Porto, Reims or Épinay in Champagne.
So Porto is relevant to our subject
indeed.
today, isn't it? And just to touch on just to touch on what Jonathan says, I think tourism is really helping to spread the message about good Portuguese wine, which is great.
It's very true. Very true.
But yeah, I think that's probably another programme that we need to do on the best wine destinations out there?
We definitely do. Yeah, I think so.
I know you'd push for Santorini. We both would, but there are so many great wine places, and not all are the obvious ones, which is the fun bit.
Exactly. So let's do it. Finally, Susie got in touch to say, until the Greek government addresses the tourism situation, I feel Peter is correct with the doomsday scenario. I lived in the Peloponnese. The government has allowed so much building work everywhere. Santorini needs to be protected, as does most of Greece. It's not happening. Pretty areas mean ka-ching. Thank you for the podcast.
Well, here's hoping the wine community can indeed fight back to protect those historic vineyards from the bulldozers, as we outlined in the programme. If anyone from the Greek government is listening, action is needed before Santorini's stunning legacy is lost forever. So thanks for that, Susie.
Yeah, and actually...
Another Susie. The very
best.
Susie.
The very best. And actually, just thinking about it, protecting and sort of cherishing a unique wine heritage is exactly what we'll be talking about in this programme, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the idea for this episode partly came from a friend giving us a bottle of wine, didn't it?
It did. So
Again,
thank you,
lovely.
Tim. Tim was interested in our take on a bottle of Portuguese red he'd been enjoying. So we cracked it open, and it was delicious. We're not talking super expensive. I think it was 10 or 12 pounds. But it does what Portugal so often does at this kind of price. It offers great value wines that are full of character without being too much, really satisfying and gluggable, but also brilliant with food.
Yeah, and I think there's a danger we take this kind of wine for granted. You can get pretty cheap wines, good value wines from Portugal, red, white or rosé, that do this brilliantly, way better than many other countries at these prices. And we're talking, I don't know, anywhere from 5 to 12 quid. But we don't really go on about them, do we?
Well, I did once, if you remember.
You did, didn't you?
That famous occasion.
You did. And I'm sure we told this story before, haven't we? But let's touch on it briefly. When you recommended...
We have said it a lot.
Porter 6, wasn't it, on Saturday Kitchen? It did break the internet.
It didn't break the internet.
Broke the internet.
Even I can't manage that.
Kim Kardashian did it.
Technophobe that I am.
Did it.
I definitely can't break the internet.
It crashed the biggest wine website in the UK. It sold out in minutes, went on to sell tens of thousands of bottles. The whole thing even got a name, the Porter 6 Effect.
Did it?
Yeah, do you not know that?
No, I didn't know that.
It's got a name.
And let's face it, this is not about me, it's about the wine. The wine was so good.
Yeah, absolutely. But, I think it sort of reinforces the point, doesn't it, that that's what these wines from Portugal can do at that level. But, I'm not sure they get the credit they deserve. We often talk about sort of Australian wine when, not that it's bad, but Portugal, I think, definitely deserves to be in with the shout. It doesn't get that shout very often. And then I get the chance to go to Portugal for an event and a tasting focused exclusively on the very top end of Portuguese wine. And I see a similar thing, amazing things, but which have somehow passed me by to date. And,
it's not like we don't know the place or its wines, is it? Yeah. But maybe it's just much more complex and interesting and multifaceted than we realise. It keeps surprising us,
I think absolutely. I think that's the thing. And I think that's what we sort of want to get into a bit here. So, when I talked to Dirk Niepoort, probably one of Portugal's finest, most thoughtful winemakers, he compared Portugal to South Africa. In the sense that it was a very closed country that suddenly opened up to the world in the 1990s. Yeah,
Portugal was quite closed or isolated politically and economically for much of the 20th century, wasn't it?
And we forget that. And wine suffered as a result. For much of the 20th century, Portugal was quite poor and underdeveloped. The cooperative movement was promoted. And in Dirk Niepoort's words, this banalised Portuguese wine. It just made it kind of lowest common denominator. But then when Portugal joined the EU in I think it was 1986, things started to open up. Investment came in. Tourists, as you said, came in greater numbers. And I think that's really helping. Winemakers also travelled and exchanged knowledge, which is absolutely key to a healthy wine sector. And the wine sector as a whole started to sort of modernise.
But that's, on the flip side, that's not always an entirely positive thing, is it? Or rather... Modernising wine in the 1990s wasn't always great, because it was a time of Robert Parker, of Roland, of standardisation of wine, of squeaky clean winemaking, which you could argue was in part driven by the New World or the Australian School of Wine at the time, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, and I think, and Dirk made this point actually. He said Portugal went from rustic but authentic wines to jumping into a very modern era dominated by winemakers, and in his words, who knew everything better. that very sort of technocratic approach. And the wines became what he described as very dull and technological. But, Dirk says now the country is getting beyond that and focusing more on the vineyard and the terroir than the winemaking, which is obviously good. And he also sees the same thing happening in South Africa, which is absolutely true as well. So I think, you can draw that comparison. You could also draw a comparison with Chile, interestingly, in the same way. Anyway, let's not digress too much. The question really is, what happens now? Yeah. Which direction is Portugal going to go in? Yeah. I think it's at a bit of a crossroads in that sense.
Yeah, I know. And sometimes you have to go too far to come back again, haven't you? Really, but the bigger point here, surely, is that if you take 1990 as a rough timeline for Portugal's new era starting, that's not actually that much time in the grand scheme of things, to modernise, to change, to evolve from quite a closed, old-fashioned system to something more in line with what people want and expect, but without losing a sense of identity at the same time.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And maybe that's partly why, we're still getting to know the real Portugal, its real potential for fine wine. But there are also advantages to blooming late, I suppose, which we'll touch on in a bit as well. Anyway, before we bring in our first guest, can I just set the scene for my recent visit and explain the other reason we're doing this episode?
Please do.
That sense? Okay.
Because you told me this was hard work, nose to the grindstone, all work and no play kind of thing.
There may have been, I think, a moment in the passport queue when that was true. Beyond that, I think it was when the Maserati came to pick me up. I knew it wasn't going to be your kind of average wine event.
Clearly not, no.
No, so this is definitely a high-end wine event. It was called Vinho da Casa in the city of Porto, organised by the Público news organisation. The idea being a cool house party filled with 20 of Portugal's very best wine producers showing off their top wines, live music, cooking, masterclasses, which is what I was there for, a masterclass, hosting a tasting of very special top-end Portuguese red wines.
And so while you were there working, you did manage to grab some of these Portuguese wine celebs to chat and share their views with us.
Exactly. So I didn't actually sit still for very, very long. I just got so overexcited, basically, tasting these wines, meeting these people. I thought, we have to make a podcast out of this. So, I grabbed mics and tried to make stuff work. I do also need to add, this was about the worst environment to record in you can imagine. Cavernous, echoey stone room. Very cool for a party, nightmare for recording. Noisy people everywhere, of course, having fun, music blaring, nightmare for sound. So I did what I could.
Didn't you take refuge on the roof in the end? Not to throw yourself off, but just
it didn't quite
try and find a quiet place.
It wasn't that bad. It was a roof terrace. Just to clarify, this wasn't illegal roof roaming. It was, it was a roof terrace. But then we had to contend with the wind, and also for one set of interviews, it was so sunny I couldn't see my screen, so I didn't realise the right mic wasn't working. But anyway, enough about my technical issues.
I think that is enough about your technical issues.
I just mentioned this to set the scene for the sound, I guess, which definitely has stuff going on in the background. It's not perfect. I think we just all need to get in the kind of rooftop party vibe. Then it's fine.
Yeah. And these, frankly, on a practical note, these interviews are not long, are they?
No.
But first up, we've got Tomas Roquette from Quinta de Crasto, a family-owned wine estate in the Douro Valley, which has a long history. And they started making table wines in the mid-1990s.
Yeah, and they've got some pretty impressive table wines too, including the single vineyards Maria Teresa and Vinha da Ponte. I was actually showing their Honore 2015 Magnum at my masterclass. It's a one-off blend of those two celebrated vineyards, and it's to mark the estate's 400th anniversary, and it's priced at a cool €1,000 for the Magnum. It's also delicious. It's sort of floral but rugged, polished and characterful. So I asked Tomas, what's exciting about Portugal and its wines right now?
For me, Portugal is the paradise in the world for the ones that love wine and food. And because we are a small country, but we are the biggest coast facing the Atlantic Ocean, we are the country with more sun hours in Europe, and it's very easy to go around. But in a small country, you can find easily more than 20 different DOC regions, wine regions, with so many different grape varieties. So, and with this new winemaking and viticulture generation, there was definitely a big transformation in the country, and associated to each region, you have a beautiful gastronomy. So for the ones that loves wine and food, this is the paradise.
You said this is the country with some of the most sunlight hours in Europe. Sometimes that can make for quite jammy, rich wines, which don't go with food very well, and yet Portuguese wines seem to go with food really well. So can you explain to me how that works?
Well, first of all, yes. I mean, if I have to put in a graphic, if we are more for light wines and more, fresh wines, or a little bit more structured and jammy, maybe we are now. Before, maybe we were a little bit more for the right, for more jammy and more extract wines. I think now we are getting a little bit more balanced. So it is possible to produce very balanced wines. It's almost possible to produce everything you want as soon as you plant or you get the grapes from the right place, with the right sun exposure, with the right altitude, with the right soil, with the right grape variety, okay? And then plus a good winemaking team, you can really surprise yourself. I think Portugal is still a diamond, unshaped, uncut, unpolished, definitely, So it's because look, I'll give you an example. We have this partnership with Chateau Lange-Bages, where we have the wine together, the Roquette. We are working together with a family that is producing red wines for more than 200 years. We started 30 years ago or 35 years ago, so everybody knows that it's a lot to learn, a lot to be discovered, because Douro is the biggest mountain viticulture in the world. So it's a big puzzle, and you're getting year after year surprise where, I didn't know that variety at this altitude facing north could produce this beautiful wine. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot to be discovered.
So a country it's easy to get around, with loads of different wine styles, loads of different regions and grape varieties, and more importantly, a country whose wine scene is still young if you look beyond port.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Crestau's been making port for hundreds of years. The estate dates back to 1615, I think, but table wine only since the mid-90s, 1994, I think. So yeah, they're all still exploring, still polishing that diamond, to follow up that metaphor, and the younger generations coming through are kind of turbocharging that trend as well. So yeah, absolutely, still young is a really important point here.
Now, Tomas mentioned grape varieties, and this is a big thing in Portugal. One of the key things about Portuguese wine are these unique grape varieties, many of them indigenous, so not really found elsewhere. Yeah. Lots of them utterly unpronounceable. I'm not even going to try. But they often make for wines that are really characterful and just a bit different, don't
absolutely,
they?
Absolutely. That's often their point of difference, that these characters are down to these amazing grape varieties. It was a point that Luís Pato made, one of, a great winemaker. Portugal needs to focus on what makes it different and special. And that's largely the grape varieties. Not many other people have them. We probably don't have time to get into the individual grape varieties too much here. Maybe that's for another one. We'll make you pronounce all of them. But I did ask every winemaker what their favourite Portuguese grape was, just to give you an idea, and I got a different answer every time. So that gives you a sense.
That sort of says it all, doesn't it? And I guess that's both good and bad, because it's easy to sell the big international grape varieties because people recognise them, they're grown everywhere, and it's hard to sell things people don't know. But at the same time, it's a real point of difference. Yeah,
and this is something that really interests me. And one particularly intriguing aspect of this is the field blends. These vineyards where all kinds of different grape varieties are planted together in the same vineyard. Historically, this was done to maximise production. Portugal is affected by weather coming in off its Atlantic coast, so vintage variation is a big deal here. In some years, some varieties might not work at all, so you planted others as an insurance policy. This is often done for port production, so it's common to find field blends, for example, in the Douro.
And you do find this elsewhere in the wine world as well, in older vineyards like, I don't know, Roussillon or Chile or California or Santorini.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's particularly prevalent in Portugal and the Douro, which obviously is the heart of port production. So, for example, with Crestau's Honore wine, I asked what varieties were in it, because I was presenting this wine at the masterclass, and effectively I just got laughed at. They said in one vineyard they'd found 54 different genotypes to date. You know,
so that's different grape
and in
varieties.
the other one, they hadn't even started the identification process. So, you know, we're talking about a real mix of stuff in these vineyards.
Well, yeah, but I guess the question is then, what does it mean for the wines?
Exactly. So I put this question to Susana Esteban, another of Portugal's top winemaking talent, even though she's originally from Galicia in Spain, actually, which you might be able to tell from her accent, her lovely accent. Now, she'd made a point of highlighting the importance of field blends in the context of what makes Portugal exciting. So I asked her how on earth you go about working with a field blend of all kinds of different grape varieties.
Well, I think it's a question of practice, because it's a little bit confused for people that usually work only with a grape. But to me, for the beginning, I always work with field blends in the Douro Valley. So it's no an analytic, it's no very scientific, because you have different grapes in different maturation stations. So it's like a feeling. You must to know very well the vineyard. You must spend a lot of time in the vineyard. So this gives a lot of complexity to the wines, because you have overripe grapes, but also some grapes. But in the middle, you have in the perfect maturation, and this is the complexity of these wines, different from the others wines, because each grapes gives something different to the wine.
So it's almost winemaking by intuition. It's a feeling.
It's a feeling. Yeah, it's a feeling, and know very, very well the vineyard, and know where is all the. And you have different years, and this is also very interesting, because in our vineyard with a field blend, the different years are you have less different into the different years. I think first they are unique, because now you go to any country in the world, you have Cabernet, you have a Shiraz, you have a Chardonnay. It's always the same. Here you have many grapes that are unique, the wines in Portugal.
So her point is the wine you make from a field blend is unique, but you have to take the time to get to know the vineyard and then almost make the wine by intuition and experience.
Yeah. And that's quite cool, isn't it? I mean, you know, this is a unique historic legacy in Portuguese wine. And if it can be preserved by, you know, forward-thinking winemakers making great wines like Susana, then that's a win-win.
I was intrigued by her saying that vintage variation is less in a field blend too.
Now, hold that thought, because I also spoke to Sandra Tavares about field blends, and she had something intriguing to say. To recap so far, though, Portugal tends to fly under the radar with its fine wines, but like an uncut diamond, there are treasures to be found here. Now, Sandra Tavares is another brilliant winemaker from Wine and Soul, among other places, but I showed her Quinta da Manuela Vinhas Velhas 2012 at the masterclass, and it was another wine from the Douro. It's a sort of piercing and spicy and just so full of energy and lift. Just a delicious wine. It's a Douro field blend, as we've been discussing, with 32 different varieties. Just think about that for a second. Anyway, she said something fascinating about field blends. Now, I do apologise for the sound here. This was when the mics and the wind started playing up a bit, but it's a short clip, and I hope you can get the gist.
Portugal is really known by the blends, so we love to blend in order to get complexity and richness. And I think the extreme in terms it's the field blends, because the field blends I think really give the total identity of a plot, a terroir.
That must be so difficult to manage, though, isn't it? and then harvest to make a good wine from.
No, it's that's the interesting thing. It's how nature works, and with the field blend, the grapes they really adapt to each other, and they create a much more complex wine. So and it's so interesting, especially now or during flowering season, we can see and we can really understand what happens on the cycle. It's because the flowering, even the cycles in different varieties. Sometimes they would flower later or earlier, but as soon as they are planted together, they tend to flower at the same time. Because if they don't, they won't be pollinized, and it's really important for them to flower at the same time in order to produce seeds. That's the goal of a plant, is to produce the seeds. So it's really interesting to see. So some varieties will have a longer ripe cycle, others shorter, and that's the amazing and thing, because you get much more complexity with different layers. So some varieties will give the freshness and higher acidity, and others will give more fruit, and more others will give the structure and the more density. So, and as winemakers, what we have to do is really to understand the vineyards. It's not, we don't have to manipulate anything in the winery. It's really.
So, do you think this sort of these blends and these field blends, is that a real strength, a USP of Portuguese wine?
I think so.
Yeah.
Because it's unique. Because the DNA of the vineyard, it's there.
So the vines synchronise flowering in a field blend to ensure good pollination. I mean, that is fascinating. And again, she makes the point about winemakers needing to understand the vineyard, but it can make for unique wines.
Absolutely. And I think this is when we start to appreciate one of the key things about Portuguese wines. And this might sound a bit odd. I'm not sure how I'm going to say this, but these top Portuguese wines, they're not obvious. You kind of need to go with the flow to a certain extent. There's a sort of magic to it that's not always easy to explain or understand. You just got to dive in. So take Dirk Niepoort, as I've said, one of the most brilliant Portuguese winemakers, even though he's actually of Dutch extraction originally. Now, he's always taking the mick out of himself for doing too many things. He reckons he makes more than 85 wines. And he does sort of crazy experiment after crazy experiment intermixed with crazy collaborations all around the world.
Yeah, I mean, what's he done? He's done stuff in sherry, hasn't he? German Riesling,
yeah,
what else?
Yes, absolutely. I think he's done stuff in Austria and South Africa as well. I don't know, but, to be honest, you lose track. There are so many cool, crazy things that he's doing. But, he says that's his way of learning, by doing stuff. Sometimes silly things, making mistakes, but always learning, pushing boundaries.
He does make more classic traditional wines too.
Yeah, of course he does. Maybe we talk about them a bit less, but I think port and Douro wines, and also in Bairrada and Dow regions. But in terms of more groundbreaking wines, at this event I tried his Koch 2020. It's a white old vine Douro field blend, but with shades of sort of Chassagne Montrachet. It's bravura winemaking, and viticulture. Then there's his ADN Loureiro Docil 2020. It's like a sort of German or Austrian Riesling off dry. Which is just slightly bad for that part of the world in the sort of Minho region. And then, when I interviewed Daniel Niepoort, Dirk's son and sixth generation winemaker, he brought along a blind red wine for me to taste. And this is what happened.
Now, you've brought a glass of wine with you.
Yes.
Shall we try it?
Of course, that would be
a
pleasure.
Thank you. So this is one of your wines, I assume. This is a beautiful ruby colour. It's not super deep. It's actually relatively pale. Oh my word, that's a wonderful aroma. That's really kind of herbal and leafy, and it's just a wonderful perfume. Putting it in a frame of reference, you're sort of in that Pinot Noir sort of Nebbiolo type territory, aren't you? It's just beautiful. Oh, gorgeous, lovely layered red fruit flavours. Herbal complexity. The tannins are very fine but quite firm, but they're mouth-watering. They make you want to have some food, have some sort of charcuterie with that, and just so long and persistent and complex. I mean, it's a wine with real elegance. It's got intensity, but it's really elegant in perfume. So, right, you're gonna have to tell us what that is.
Actually, really nice. So for all the listeners, he didn't know what is that at all. And it's actually a bit of an unusual wine for us, I would say, because normally we really into the Portuguese field blend, and we really like to kind of use the grapes we have here, because we have many, and that's very good. But this is a little different experiment.
Okay.
Because as you might, and some people know, we make way too many wines. But that's our way to learn. And this is a Pinot, what we do in Douro. No.
This is Pinot.
Yeah. So it's
In the Douro.
really, it's really not the region where you should plant Pinot. But as my father, he really loves Pinot, and actually I have to say, the older the vineyard gets, then stable, because it's a really complicated grape in Douro. Douro is just too hot, so it's always the first or one of the first we pick. It's in the first or second week of August. And it's really challenging because you go and check out the vineyard to make a plan when to pick, and it seems all green, and then you go 2 days or 3 days after and it's perfect, and if you just miss it and you have like 2 days more, then it's just overripe. So it's quite challenging, and this is 2020, and so we like the herbiness, and it comes because we like to work with stems, so that's where also some of the tannins come, and we kind of like that to give it a bit more of freshness and grip, and then in the end it's really an idea to make an elegant wine from such a rough and hot region like Douro. Huh?
Wow, so this was a Pinot Noir from the Douro, which you'd think would be the last place you'd plant Pinot. And it was really good. You really rated it?
I really did. And I had to taste it again just to be sure it was the real deal. And it really was, And the Douro, I mean, we haven't explained, but the Douro Valley, this incredibly hot, steep-sided, beautiful river valley that goes from the Portuguese west coast up to the Spanish border. It's generally pretty hot and torrid.
It is very hot.
What's the famous thing? It's a couple of months of winter and then 9 months of hell is the way that, So this is a hot place. Yeah. And yet you can make a wine like this, which is so poised and balletic and elegant. It's unbelievable. I think it just goes to show that Portugal is capable of making fine wines that defy expectations. And that's why I love the Niepoort wines, and we've got some here to taste, haven't we, as well? Daniel said, Portugal is this small little place people don't really know, but it's got big potential combining old knowledge with new ideas.
I think that combination of old and new does seem to be at the heart of Portugal's identity.
Yeah, absolutely, totally. And this was actually something that Dirk, his dad, Dirk Niepoort, said too, that the tradition is key there. They haven't really gone down the international grape variety route and simplifying things in that process. As for why...
And because we were backward and we didn't have money, we probably didn't change so fast. And so we got stuck to the old wines and to our own varieties. And this is good news today. And while selling a Rabo do Velha variety was impossible, selling a field blend, the people looked at me and said, what the fuck is that? Now it's exotic. It's positive. And people say, oh, it's not Chardonnay. Oh, I want to try that. I want to see it. I want to understand it. Tell me about it.
So are we going to see more and more experimentation? Is that part of the way that Portugal's going to develop and needs to develop?
What I'm seeing is the technical mass wines are getting a lot cleaner and a lot better, which is a good thing, but not necessarily in copying the new worlds. So even the cheaper wines have a bit of personality. But I think what really interests our discussion today is great producers really identifying more clearly where are they, and trying to understand the situation, the vineyards, the varieties, the soils, the climate conditions, and making small batches of interesting, daring wines and changing the world in a positive way.
Changing the world through daring wines. Now, there's a strapline if ever there was one.
Yeah, there are lots of examples in Portugal. I chatted with Luís Pato at this event too. Another of, as I said, Portugal's most famous winemakers, another restless innovator. I think I called him the Salvador Dali of Portuguese wine to his face. So he did laugh. Anyway, and he was talking to me about his experiments with, for example, hyperoxygenation for his fizz and using ozone instead of copper in the vineyards and planting without rootstocks. All this kind of stuff. We actually tried a wine from vines planted on their own roots in the masterclass at Quinta do Ribeirinho Pé Franco 2005 from Bairrada, which is made from the Baga grape variety. It's just incredibly pure and fine and elegant. It's one of the best wines in that region, if not in Portugal.
And you said he was keen to promote Portugal on the basis of its unique grape varieties.
Yeah, exactly. That's what he said. It's old planting, it's field blends, it's really diverse regions from Minho, the land of fresh, crisp white Vinho Verde in the north west, down to the sort of sunny, bold reds of Alentejo and the Algarve, and it's people too, including the new generation like Daniel Niepoort. All of these things make it so special.
They do. And on that note, I reckon we should get tasting. And we have an amazing lineup.
Who resisted this? I think we've been talking too much, haven't we? We really do have an amazing lineup here. So just to be clear, we're focusing on Portuguese fine wine here. You started already.
I have already.
Right.
Sorry.
Okay.
I've waited a long time.
Yeah.
I've listened and
Anyway,
I've waited.
This is you just heard the word fine wine and you just tucked it in. So this is the top end of things. It's not. These wines aren't cheap, basically. But, I spoke with Raymond Reynolds, who's a leading importer of Portuguese wines in the UK. And he said that selling expensive Portuguese wine is a challenge, but to quote him, above £15 is where the real Portugal begins to shine and where you get viticultural treasures and excitement from talented producers.
Okay, well, I think he's right because we've got a few gems here and we're going to whiz through them, but we'll put more details on our show notes and website. So starting with the whites, I absolutely love this wine I've got in my glass, which is the Viñas Velhas Branco 2022 by Luis Pato.
Yeah.
Now, it's a blend of, get this, Bical, Cecial and Cecialinho. Is that right? Have I pronounced that correctly?
I have no idea. Can I just apologise generally for our Portuguese pronunciation? It's not very good.
It's horrendous.
We just sort of say
anyway, something like that. What you said. And it's from the Bairrada region. It's £20. It's got a lovely orangey character. It's lively and energetic and genuinely it just makes me happy.
Yeah,
every time I pick this up.
It is cool. And, if it makes you happy, it's a good sign. I mean, I wasn't quite so keen, I have to be honest.
What can you not like about that?
There's lots to it. I think I preferred his Viña Formal, which is also here, another white from Bairrada. It's just a bit more elegant and restrained, and I slightly preferred that.
I think we're
style.
going to disagree on quite a few of these, aren't we? In the best possible way.
No, and actually this is important,
and
we can touch on what this says about the wines in due course. It's important that we don't agree about all these wines. On that very theme, I've got a wine here. This is one I loved and you didn't. This was the Susana Esteban Procura Branco 2020. So we heard from Susana. This is a field blend, a white field blend from the São Mamede Hills in Alentejo. It's really characterful, not at all obvious. It's full of sort of baked cream and bruised red apple aromas. It's got a sort of mouth coating style in the mouth, doesn't it? It's sort of like a cross of Southern Rhone white and old champagne that's gone flat. It's gutsy.
I'm not sure you're selling it.
It's full of personality. No. I love it. I mean, because it's uncompromising and it's different. Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to be honest and say, for me, what the first wine had was the zest. This is totally opposite, which is fine. It's horses for courses, but this is for me just a bit too oily and broad.
It's from the Alentejo.
It reminds
sun here. I know it's altitude, but you get.
It almost reminded me bizarrely of Fino Sherry, which doesn't sound quite right because that's not broad and oily.
There, but that's partly why I quite like it.
There's something about it. Yeah. There's a flavour in there that's similar. Yeah. But another interesting one was the Niepoort Redoma. Do you say Redoma Branco? Redoma Branco 2021. No, now, this is an intriguing wine because initially it starts quite reserved, but then over time in bottle, a lovely, and then glass, a lovely kind of struck match, or as you called it in one of our episodes, snap, crackle and pop. That nutty, flinty character started to emerge and it is really attractive. My only thing to say here would be, I wonder if the early harvest, which I assume is what happened given it's only got 11.5% alcohol, for me, it just means it's a little tiny bit lacking concentration on the palate.
Well, I quite like that, though. It means it's
a
lighter
style.
style.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. It sort of means you can drink more. I know what you mean. You almost want a bit more from it.
The nose makes me think I'm going to get a bit more.
Yes, I agree.
But there's nothing wrong with a light wine.
It's very drinkable.
Yeah.
And you do get a lovely texture and finesse on the palate. I thought this was beautiful in that sense. It's seamless. Maybe not the most sexy, but a really grown-up, proper, lovely white wine. Anyway, moving on into the reds. We disagreed a bit here too, it's fair to say, but there were a couple of exceptions, one of which, and I'm going to start on a consensus, one of which was the Meandro do Vale Miau 2020 from the Douro utterly captivating aromas in this wine, aren't they? You don't even have to smell it or smell it. It just
Smell
leaks out
it.
of the glass.
Did you say smell?
Smell.
Smell it.
Well,
is that...
we should all smell it. Do you not smell your
Why
wine?
say swirl and smell when you could just say smell?
One must always smell the wine. It's floral and peppery and
It really was
piercing
lovely,
aromas
wasn't it?
of blackberries and stuff. And then on the palate, it's spicy and energetic, and it's it's 25 quid, so it's not crazy.
Which in the context, I mean,
Yeah.
we should say this.
Yeah.
25 quid is not cheap, but some of these wines
But this is a
are
proper wine
really
from
pretty
Douro. It's
expensive.
lovely, really nice.
Exactly.
Great
It's a classic Douro blend of mainly Touriga Nacional, so hence that floral peppery character, and Touriga Franca, plus a few others. Do love some good Touriga Nacional.
Yeah, no, this one is great, worth highlighting. Nearly went extinct, but has been made a comeback in Down and Douro, and it's got this floral. It's a bit like Syrah sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, to me, this is the epitome of good red Douro table wine. But moving on, we come on to something that we definitely didn't agree on.
This next
Is that
one.
fair?
All right, let me just move the
You
bottle
tried very
over
hard.
here. I'm going to move it slightly my way a bit more. Not that's necessary.
You should, actually.
I think one of the things I found fascinating at this tasting in Porto was getting to know Alicante Boucher from the Alentejo. Now, Alicante Boucher, this is a historic speciality. Alicante Boucher is not very highly thought of as a grape variety in wine generally. It's a Tinturier grape, so a rare grape whose flesh is red as well as the skin. Usually in a red grape, the flesh is not red, it's just the skin. Often this grape is used to add colour in a blend, so it's thought of as, not particularly just use it as a blending component. But in the Alentejo, in sort of warm, dry centre-south of Portugal, it was apparently introduced by the Reynolds family in the late 19th century, and it's just sort of taken to the place. And now you find old vines giving the most amazing wines from this grape variety.
But is it fair to say it's an acquired taste?
Yeah, you don't look convinced.
It's quite punchy,
yeah,
isn't
absolutely.
it?
No. These are wines. These are not wines for the faint-hearted. Classic Alentejo Alicante Boucher, from what I've experienced, is a bit rustic. It's often minty blackberry and really dense tannin, often with quite a leathery or dried meat character, which I would say I love. It's hearty, and the best ones are really, really special. So I mentioned the Reynolds family. There's lots of offshoots of the Reynolds family. I was originally a British merchant family who were out there and sort of settled. And Raymond Reynolds is part of that. They're doing really good things with this. So Julio Bastos and Julian Reynolds. Plus I had a 1978 Tapado de Chaves, at the tasting, which features Alicante Boucher, which was glorious. But the one we got here is the bottle I've been edging to myself, and I've got a full glass of here, is the Mouchao Tonel 3 to 4, 2013. This is an epic wine. It's meaty, it's leathery, it's sort of dry, dark fruit, cedar, mint. It's very firm on the palate, but it's also very fine and fresh. I think this will age forever. We tried the 2001 in my masterclass, but it's kind of, for me, it's what you get if you mash up in one glass some really cool Northern Rhone, bit of claret, a bit of Madiran, a bit of Cahors, a bit of Chianti. I could go on.
A packet of tunes. Sorry, I'm being really facetious.
There is a bit of mintiness in there, but it's not.
I did find it a bit much. But
it is full on. It's full on.
Yeah, and it is aging nicely. It's it's complex. It's just personally not my favourite. And I'd also raise a point at this stage. This wine is an Alentejo legend, is it not?
It is.
But it is 190 odd quid a bottle, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we've seen that with some other wines too. For example, the Niepoort is £50. Your Magnum in your masterclass, as we've said, was €1,000. And we're going to come on to another expensive wine too in a moment. I just wonder if the top level of Portuguese wine exists in a slightly parallel universe when it comes to pricing. Perhaps because locally people will pay a lot of money. But I'm just not sure how easy that then becomes in international markets for people to buy into it.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think there's also often an element of sort of rusticity or age in the style too, which I think can be lovely, but isn't for everyone. It kind of polarizes, doesn't it? Equally, these are some truly great wines, highly individual, made with great care, preserving historic legacies. They deserve to be in fine wine territory. So we're arguing over sort of small differences, I think.
And when we say fine wine, we were sent a very, very special bottle to taste, weren't we? Which we do agree on.
We have it here.
We totally agree on.
Wow, it's right here. We are in the presence of legend, as you said. This is Barca Velha 2011. Possibly the most famous Portuguese table wine.
I think so, yeah.
Created in 1952. Interestingly, just a year after Penfolds Grange, another iconic blended red was created by Max Schubert in Australia. And both of those countries were, fortified wine was the prevalent thing at the time. Which is an interesting thought. Anyway, so this was the time of port, really. So an ambitious table wine made in sort of Heath Robinson fashion in the isolated reaches of the Douro was quite revolutionary. And it's a wine designed to age forever and showcase the very best of the Douro. So a blend of power and refinement. And it's only made in certain years. I think since 1952, it's only been declared 20 times. So what, out of a possible 70?
Yeah. I mean, interesting the coincidence with Grange's first vintage. Anyway, so this is a cool £600 a bottle, isn't it? I think Grange is around the same price.
Yeah.
And there are similarities in concept, as you say, if not style. You could call it the Petrus of Portugal if you wanted another strap line. But I'm interested in the fact that it's really not declared every year by any means.
Yeah. So I chatted with winemaker Luis Sotomayor at this event. He is notoriously stringent when it comes to declaring Barca Velha. And he says a lot of that is down to the fact he has to be utterly convinced of the wine's aging potential. So, for example, 2007 was an amazing vintage in the Douro. Everyone expected Barca Velha to be declared, but he said no. And he sort of joked to me that the Sograt chairman, a company who owns Barca Velha, joked with him that he just lost the company 10 million euros with that decision, that one word.
No.
But no, I think it was all in good humour. But, then he did declare the 2008 vintage, which no one was expecting, but which in his view was a sort of less obvious vintage, but more discreet and capable of more graceful and better aging. And that gives you a sense of what this wine is all about.
So what's the process then? What happens if he doesn't decide to declare it?
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. So they also make a wine called Reserva Especial. We tried the 1992 and 1989 Reserva Especial, or Reserva at the event, which were both amazing. But, this is what I find interesting. That decision-making process can take, between 7 and 10 years before he makes a final call on it. So, this really isn't a lightweight project. It's serious, and there's a lot of thought that goes into it. And, Luis feels the pressure. He says there's huge amounts resting on making the right decision.
On which note, we should taste this bottle and find out properly, should we not?
Thought you'd never ask. Let's cut to the chase.
Yeah, I mean, what it is incredibly dark, first of all. It's very complex aromatically. My initial reaction when I first stuck my nose in the glass is that there are hints of good Bordeaux here. Cedar and some dried fruit, some bell pepper, a bit of creaminess too. But it's just multi-layered, isn't it?
There's just so much going on, isn't there?
Yeah, it's a fine wine.
You also get I agree, there's some sort of Bordeaux-esque. I mean, they're not exclusive to Bordeaux, those aromas, are they? So maybe it's unfair. But, there's definitely that.
But that's your sort of classic.
There is an element of that. But there's
comparison.
also the sort of florality and the sort of pepper of the Douro as well, isn't there? There's a slight sort of extravagance there, a sort of wild mint note. All of those I associate with the Douro.
Can smell. And then in your mouth, it's just incredibly smooth. It's got very fine chalky tannin. I mean, yes, the alcohol is 14.5%, but... and this is what matters, it's wonderfully fresh still and compelling and balanced. It's just a superb wine. It's a great example of its style, if there is such a thing as its style. It holds its own in the company of, I'd say, some of the finest full-bodied red wines in the world.
Yeah, it's an incredible blend of power and finesse, isn't it? It sort of makes you catch your breath. I think both of us did that when we were initially
really
tasting it. You're sort of,
it's
overwhelming.
I wanted to like it, but I really wasn't. I thought if we don't, we don't.
Yeah, but it stops you. It stops you in your tracks. Yeah, I think that's the best way of saying it.
Totally.
The tannins, it's kind of almost overwhelming. The tannins are so fine. And silky, but they're also quite rugged. And it had shades of vintage port, doesn't it? And you can sense it's from a country of vintage port, but it's also crossed with really sort of fine Bordeaux. So it's got that fire in its belly. of the best wines of this region, but it's also got, that silkiness and that elegance. So, yeah, you could call it the Petrus of Portugal, but really, I think it's a wine very much of its place. A great showcase for the Douro, and I think Luis's job is safe, isn't it?
What a great note to end on.
Yeah, actually, yeah. So we can just go and polish the rest of the bottle off, isn't it?
Good plan. Good plan. I was hoping that you were going to say that. So, by way of a brief summary, Portugal tends to fly under the radar for its fine table wines, but that means it offers real intrigue for wine lovers. These are wines brimming with character and attitude and ambition in the best sense, made from unique grape varieties by forward-thinking winemakers. It does also mean they can be acquired tastes, and they might not please everyone, as I think we've fully demonstrated. But they are well worth exploring.
We didn't argue. We didn't get into full-blown argument, did we? We just agreed to disagree.
As we always do.
Yes. Anyway, so I'd like to personally thank Publico for hosting the Vinho da Casa event, which led to this podcast, and to all the winemakers for putting up with my incessant questions as well. Thanks also to Raymond Reynolds, Liberty Wines and ABS for these delicious wines we've been trying on the show. And sorry for all my epic technical fails on location.
Most importantly, as ever, thank you for joining us. We'll put all the photos, wines and links up from this episode on our website as show notes. Until next time, cheers.